Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Geneva Center for Security Policy and welcome to Security in Law, a Reality Check. Security in Law, a Reality Check is an event series that addresses how international law matters in security affairs. And that's exactly what we're going to do today regarding war algorithms. So what we all know is that in today's everyday life, artificial intelligence, machine learning, etc., is really present. It's real. So we're thinking of Google searches, Amazon recommendations, Siri's responses, and other applications. Now, fewer people know that actually artificial intelligence and machine learning is already reality concerning law enforcement and criminal justice. So these tools actually, based on predictive algorithms, advise judges on sentencing and organize police patrolling. So if we take it from there, we can only imagine and ask ourselves, well, what does this mean, these technologies then, regarding future conflicts and the war fighting in the future? So can we develop those tools? Will they be developed? And then, since we're talking of security and law, how does this relate to the legal framework, the existing legal framework, eventually new legal frameworks? So today is really this reality check in the sense of being realistic, not speculating, not doing science fiction, but really having our feet on the ground and starting to reflect on these questions. And with this, we're honored to have the best on this here with us today, Professor Ashley Deeks. Professor Ashley Deeks is a professor of law at the University of Virginia and has a very impressive curriculum. She is a member of the U.S. State Department's Advisory Committee on International Law. She serves as a senior contributor to the Lawfare blog. She also serves on the boards of editors of the American Journal of International Law, also the Journal of National Security Law and Policy, and she's supervising editor for Agile Unbound, and also a senior fellow at the Lieber Institute for Law and Land Warfare. She was the assistant legal advisor for political military affairs in the US State Department's Office of the Legal Advisor. To be more straightforward, a very good friend of mine who is a very experienced government lawyer just calls her one of the smartest lawyers I've ever met. So
I need to know who that was.
Yeah, I won't reveal my sources. So Professor, thank you very much for being here, for taking your time. As a format, what we propose is that we engage in a discussion, in a conversation, but really then give the hand over to have you lead and take over the conversation. So we'll start with a couple of questions and then really go over to Q&As and interactive discussions, if that's okay. One administrative notice: we're filming the initial conversation, but after that, when we're giving you the mic, we're gonna, for privacy issues, we're gonna stop filming. So please feel free to be provocative, to be stimulating, to be whatever you want to say it. I think that's the beauty of the whole event today. So Professor, if I may, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. First of all, what do we mean with artificial intelligence and machine learning, specifically in law enforcement and in criminal justice? Is this science fiction? Is this reality? Can you give examples? And if you're looking at the technologies, which ones of those do you think that could eventually be used in warfare?
Great, thanks very much. And before I start, I'll just say thank you to Tobias for the invitation. I'm looking forward to the conversation. And I should say, I know that I'm in Europe and not the United States because the Q&A will not be filmed. GDPR has not yet hit the United States, as you know. A little less on the privacy front at this point, but maybe it's coming. Anyway, so when we talk about AI, when we talk about machine learning, what are we really talking about? Both of those terms, and in particular the concept of AI, there is no one fixed definition of artificial intelligence. So it's often used when we're referring to a set of techniques that tries to replicate in some way human cognition, or things that we expect humans with intelligence can do. So computer vision, for example, is often thought of as an AI tool because you have a system that's effectively seeing in the way that a human would see. being able to process natural language, also something we think of as requiring some form of intelligence to do. We're now starting to see systems that are able to process the human voice. A couple of examples, Tobias already gave a few, but the systems on your Netflix that can recommend new movies to you based on the kinds of movies that you have enjoyed in the past. That's a form of artificial intelligence. You've also probably heard about the game of Go, a Chinese board game, very complicated. There are now systems that can beat the best human competitors at Go. And interestingly, the systems also are training each other. They're training against themselves to improve their capabilities. So that's another example, not in the military context. Machine learning is a term you'll often hear as well. These are algorithms that effectively learn on their own after they are trained on a set of data. So I think maybe an example is useful. Let's think about lung cancer diagnoses. You have 5,000 slides with some of which show lung cancer and some of which don't, and you know which those are. You feed them to the algorithm and you tell them, okay, algorithm, these 2,500 do have it, these don't. System says okay. And it learns which aspects of the X-ray are important for the diagnosis. But they're not necessarily, that's not programmed into the system. It learns on its own. So then you apply test data, you show it 500 slides where you know the answer and it doesn't, and you see how it does. And they've now developed systems that are, I think, as accurate, if not more accurate than human physicians. But notice that we don't always know quite how the machine achieves the prediction that it does. So this is part of what's sometimes referred to as a black box, where we know what the outcome is, what the prediction is by the system, but we can't necessarily quite figure out how it got there. So what tools are likely to appear in warfighting? So again, trying to be realistic and keep the conversation out of science fiction, certainly things like facial recognition software clearly will be used are being used in law enforcement and immigration, clearly will be used in the military setting, I think on the battlefield. We're starting to see systems where the goal is to try to identify anomalies. Maybe you've heard of a project called Project Maven, which Google was working on. And I think the idea was there's so much video being picked up by drones, other airborne systems, thousands and thousands of hours. And rather than have a set of soldiers stare at the screen and try to pick out, oh, there's somebody who looks like he's doing something suspicious with a package, the Project Maven idea was to have the system itself identify anomalies and basically flag them for the user. And that was controversial, and so some of Google's employees thought that was controversial, and they urged Google not to renew its contract because they thought it could facilitate targeted killings. Lightning fast identification of objects, right? One of the advantages of AI and machine learning is being able to process large volumes of data quickly, detect patterns and detect anomalies. Iron Dome, for example, which is an Israeli system, basically identifies incoming missiles and shoots them down. We can talk about, I think there's a man on the loop in those systems, but it's quick target identification, potentially faster than a human could. And finally, as you know, since this is Geneva, there are debates about whether we're going to see lethal autonomous weapon systems. And there the idea is systems that can basically be programmed, presumably to comply with the laws of armed conflict, and you send them out and they identify targets on their own without further intervention by humans and can use force against those actors. So whether that's sci-fi or not, I don't know. But I think I would be remiss in not mentioning that, given that that is really a large part of what has been driving the conversation in the sphere we're talking about here, the overlap between military force and international law. That's sort of the hot topic. Let me quickly then jump to, okay, well, how about law enforcement? So In the United States, there are a number of jurisdictions at the federal level, state and local level that are using predictive algorithms. Not all of these algorithms are machine learning algorithms. I think a few are, some are not. They're sort of sophisticated regression analyses. And the idea is that these systems will help judges and parole boards when the judges are trying to figure out how, should we release somebody on bail? Will they come back to stand trial? They're all really trying to push on whether somebody is dangerous. And so we're starting to see these predictive algorithms provide bands of predictions about somebody. Are they high risk of being a recidivist, medium risk, low risk? And further, we're seeing predictive policing tools. So tools that take into account, so Chicago, for example, using these, taking into account the specifics of neighborhoods. What kind of, where are we most likely to see crime occur in the next 24 hours? And the idea is that you are helping police departments figure out where to most effectively use their limited resources. Where should we go on patrol in the next 24 hours to try to basically fend off crimes before they happen? And so the algorithms will take into account where past crimes have occurred, what kinds of crimes they were, time of day, what day of the week, right? It changes whether it's a Monday or a Saturday. It changes whether it's a full moon or a totally dark night. That actually affects what kind of crimes might take place. And then it updates itself each shift. So that's the predictive policing model. And as you suggest, I think that some of those tools, police have to ask questions about dangerousness and where should I patrol. Those are actually similar questions to what the military has to ask. So as you know, I wrote a paper trying to tease out the extent to which we'll see those kinds of algorithms appear in the military space.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. You talked a lot about the technology, the new technology, and so one main concern, I think Geneva-based diplomats know that, hear that often. One main concern is that artificial intelligence actually and machine learning they de facto replace human decision making. So even if humans remain on the loop or even in the loop, it can be that there could be what some call the automation gap. So basically, the more sophisticated the technology becomes, well, the quicker it elaborates complex sets of data, and the higher the risk actually of over-reliance in the machine. Because even if humans can actually trace and understand what the decision is about, it can't really understand, as you said with the black box also, it can't really scrutinize how the machine got there and what it took into account and whatnot. So how do you see that problematic? And if we're thinking now of the rules of international humanitarian law, so the rules of how you fight war, how do you see that?
Right. So this is a good question, and it's definitely worth exploring. So. I think your question goes to what's often referred to as automation bias. And this is this idea that if you are a human going about your business and you're working with a machine that is giving you predictions or estimations, there's a tendency to try to trust that you will trust the machine, particularly if it seems to be providing reasonable recommendations and so on. Even they found that judges who have 25 years of experience and might have an inclination to go a different way in a particular case, maybe to sentence somebody to 5 years instead of 7, might end up sentencing to 7 if the system suggests that the person is high risk. So that's a sort of trust in the machine, whether warranted or not. So that's the automation bias. And I think that gets exacerbated in contexts such as Iron Dome, where you have a system. Again, I think it's created to have a man on the loop, meaning somebody could intervene. The system will pop up and say, incoming missile in X location, we detect the footprint or the signature. And the person has a very short period of time, let's say 10 seconds, to say yes or no. When you're under pressure, the automation bias, the instinct to agree with the machine is going to be higher because you don't even have time to step back and think, okay, what's the basis for this prediction? Does this seem like other cases I've been involved with? That kind of thing. So that gets accelerated as well. And I think there's also an institutional factor here. So let's say you're a general in charge of detention, and there's assume a military predictive algorithm that suggests that a particular detainee poses an imperative threat to security. So under the laws of war, you could continue to detain him. And the general says, you know what? He seems very remorseful. He has a reasonably credible story about what he was doing. I think we should release him. You release him, and 2 days later, he kills 3 American service members. The general is thinking, oh boy, that is, it's a terrible thing that they were killed, and furthermore, the machine suggested he was dangerous, and I disregarded it. Right, so you can imagine ex ante that the general can foresee that in mind happening, and so there are maybe institutional reasons where it's easier to go along with what the machine is predicting, even if you're not totally sure that it's right, because you don't have to explain yourself after the fact. So, so how do we deal with this? So a couple of potential ways to try to manage it. One is we know about algorithmic bias, and so you can potentially train people to try to not fall prey to it where it would be inappropriate to fall prey to it. So maybe that means the military creating clear expectations about when it's appropriate to disregard a computer-generated suggestion. And there are maybe also a couple of technological fixes. So one is a concept you've been hearing, I think, maybe more about recently, which is called explainable AI or XAI. So the idea here is that the systems themselves resist becoming black boxes because they're built that way. You have people either crafting algorithms that are where the system it's easier to see what happened in the process. People are also creating systems that run alongside black box systems that try to create human explanations for what the black box is doing, and so on. So there are some technological fixes there. And my guess is the militaries are going to want to demand this, because the militaries want to trust the algorithms that they're using, or I should say, they want their algorithms to be reliable, and the way to figure out if it's reliable is to know what it's basing its recommendations on. So I think the militaries might sort of push things this direction anyway. And notice also that this is more of a sociological point, but I think it matters how the prediction is presented. So if somebody says to you, this person has a 30% chance of reoffending, or somebody says, this person is low risk, or somebody says, this person's in the bottom third, you might have different reactions to all of those outputs depending on how it's framed. So that suggests that the military should work with its lawyers and maybe sociologists or cognitive behavioralists to try to kind of get the most objective framing of the recommendations. Interesting.
So what you're saying with objectivity and the framing and all that then leads to the outcome, what an algorithm gives. And that really depends on programming, on the one hand, how you program the system, on the other hand, the data that you enter, because it relies on data most of the time, on big data. So if we're looking at the experience in law enforcement, well, there actually you can say that, well, the agents operate in a known environment, and you can therefore create a predictive algorithm. But how is that then with warfare, which by definition soldiers, military operate in an unknown environment? You have volatile environments, complex, data poor, rapidly changing. So do you think that actually is possible to create predictive systems for warfighting? And how do you assure, or is it possible to ensure a reliable data, which is what you mentioned?
Right, so I think this is a key question. I went recently, this past fall, Harvard and the ICRC set up a sort of neat conference. It was an AI boot camp for lawyers and an IHL boot camp for computer scientists. And I recommend that any of you who have the capacity to recreate that, it's an extremely useful and thought-provoking setting. So my takeaway as somebody who was an IHL person participating in the AI boot camp was that data is everything. The data, these are systems that rely on big data for accuracy, and doing things with 125 examples is not going to get you a reliable prediction. Doing something with 100,000 examples where the data is sort of clean and of high quality, much better chance that you're going to have something accurate. And of course, when we're talking about Netflix or Google Maps, we're talking about millions of data points, millions and millions. So I think it's absolutely the right question to ask. Bad or biased data will lead to bad or biased predictions. Now, of course, the military doesn't want bad predictions, right? If it's trying to predict where an IED is going to go off next, it is not to its advantage to have a poorly crafted algorithm, right? So there are, I think, some institutional reasons why we might feel some confidence that the military is not going to try to use terrible data to achieve its goal because it's not in its own self-interest. But I also think there will be different answers to your question depending on which LOAC bucket we're in. So if we are, we're a military trying to develop a risk forecasting algorithm related to, so looking at a sea of people and trying to have the system identify somebody with an RPG over their shoulder. So there you have millions of pictures of people, you have millions of pictures of RPGs, right? You have a lot of data on which you could train those systems. I think a harder question is the detention question. So some of the studies that have been done on the criminal justice predictive algorithms using 500,000 cases of people detained in over 10 years, you're right that it's a much more known environment, right? You don't know everything, but you know the person's age, where the person lives, what his employment history is, what his marital status is. So it's much more of a known system. If you're a military who comes, let's imagine the US military going into Iraq in 2003. At the beginning, actually, they didn't have to assess dangerousness because it was an international armed conflict and Saddam's army was mostly prisoners of war. But as that conflict morphed, and the US started fighting non-state actors, what did it know about the Mahdi army? Not much, right? As the conflict goes on, you start to learn a lot more about the people fighting you, about their relationships, about their sort of where they live, who their friends are, whether they had been in detention under Saddam, those kinds of things. So if you end up with enough data over time, you might be able to develop a reliable predictive algorithm. But note also that your enemies change. So we were fighting the Mahdi army in, I don't know, 2005. 2007, you might be fighting Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and the predictive algorithm you had for the first won't necessarily work for the second. So I think the detention context is a harder setting. But so I guess two more quick points. One is, militaries are also going to use AI for less controversial reasons, settings, command and control, logistics. There, I think the military has a lot of very clean data that it could use, that's not a hard case. But I do think that militaries that are getting into this business really need to be thinking about now about their data is the fuel for the future. And so the cleaner it is, the more accurate it is, and the more of it they have on these particular questions, the more reliable their algorithms will be in the future.
Interesting. Thank you very much. And you mentioned detention, risk assessments, etc. So that leads to then another question, which actually, if you're saying that predictive algorithms, as you said, has someone already have been detained, how was different or similar behavior from a similar group of sample, etc. Well, basically, the predictive algorithms make the decisions based on previous behavior from other suspects or from other agents or persons, etc. So thinking of detention and of risk assessments and internments, etc., do you think this actually complies with international humanitarian laws requirement that actually there are individual decisions? And if you even go a little beyond international humanitarian law, thinking of human rights, what about the obligations regarding due process, fair trial, liberty, etc.? How do you see that? Is that a dilemma? And if yes, is there a way out of this dilemma?
So as a former government lawyer, I'll just go back on that first point. So not everybody, I think, would would agree with the point that we need to worry not only about the laws of armed conflict, but also IHL, at least in international armed conflicts. But I think your underlying point is a good one, and it was one I hadn't really thought of when I'd first written the piece, but it came up afterwards. I was talking to a judge, a Dutch judge, who said, you know, I don't really get how it would be fair to make a prediction about somebody based not on that person's behavior, but based on the behavior of 10,000 other people on whom the algorithm was trained, right? So the idea is, if you have an algorithm that predicts with a high level of confidence that everyone with characteristics A, B, and C will fall into the low-risk category, or let's say high-risk category, person Q comes along and has characteristics A, B, and C, the judge is going to say, I have a very reliable algorithm that predicts you're going to be in the high risk, right? But not necessarily based on anything the person's done at that time, maybe based on some of his inherent characteristics, past actions. And so the question is that right or fair? And as you suggest, both, so the law of armed conflict anticipates individualized judgments about detention, whether to keep somebody in detention. And international human rights law clearly also does anticipate that. So how do we think about this? Well, it is right that these systems all rely on correlation and not causation, right? So they are not making causal claims about why somebody is a high risk. They're just predicting that somebody is. So I guess I'd say three things. First of all, in my paper, I'm anticipating only that these are tools that humans can use to help their ultimate judgment. So I'm still envisioning a role for a human decision maker in detention and in targeting. I'm not in the lethal autonomous weapon system or the lethal autonomous detention system or whatever you want to call it. I'm still envisioning a role for the human, and that I think is one place where individualized judgment about the person in front of you would remain in place. A second thing I would say is, if we're comparing machine predictions to human predictions, we should actually think about the question, do judges really only make decisions based on the person in front of them? I think judges have their own algorithms, right? We just don't call them algorithms. But somebody comes in front of me, I'm a judge, and the person is very much like somebody I sentenced last week. I'm going to have that person from last week in mind, right? And notice, but I'm a human, so I can't keep that many cases in mind. There may be a few really salient ones, but maybe I can think about 10 or 12 cases at a time, where the predictive algorithm can think about 5,000 cases at a time, or 50,000 cases at a time. So that's, I think, one reason why people are turning to these algorithms, because they can keep more data in mind in their recommendations than humans can. Also note that these algorithms will sometimes, in the bail context, they will sometimes argue for release. That this person, yeah, we're confident, the algorithm says high likelihood this person will come back to stand trial, right? I think people often assume that the algorithm is going to make the more aggressive recommendation, and I think that's not necessarily true, nor has it necessarily borne out in practice. You can also, anyway, so I think it could be possible for algorithms to end up being more reliable. We could have a conversation here among the group about what that actually means and how you test reliability in that setting. I think that's a hard question too. But I guess that's what I would say about that.
Thank you very much. And so up to this stage, we've talked a lot about the war fighting in armed conflict. We're really talking at the operational level. If we take a little bit of step back to the strategic macro level, do you see or foresee or think it's possible an application of machine learning by governments in politically sensitive decisions like those of resorting to force? So basically, do you see these predictive algorithms influencing decision making about whether or not to go to war in the first place?
Right, so this is a use ad bellum question as opposed to a use in bello question. With a couple of colleagues from the UK, we wrote a piece exploring whether it seemed possible or likely that governments were going to try to use machine learning algorithms in the use ad bellum setting. And we thought that there were three contexts in which it seemed possible that governments might do so. So I would just say this is a little more speculative, I think, than the use in bello, where we see militaries actually doing a little bit more of what I've just been talking about already. I don't think we've seen anything yet in the use ad bellum setting. So the three places where we thought that governments might try to use these tools were assessing anticipatory self-defense, engaging in cyber self-defense, and thinking about the rules of necessity and proportionality. So let me just say a little bit about each of those. So many of you may know this, but in the law of the charter and the use ad bellum, you're allowed to use force in self-defense. And many people, though not everybody, many people think that you may also use force in anticipatory self-defense, where you think that the attack is imminent and you don't have to wait for the actual strike to occur, but you have to be very confident that it's going to occur. So we thought that it's possible that states might try to use some sort of machine learning tools to give them predictions in this setting. So what we had in mind was that militaries might try to assess the likelihood that certain pre-attack activities that they saw by other states were going to result in an actual attack, right? Which would be relevant when you're conducting an anticipatory self-defense analysis. And one thing that made us think this is we know publicly the UN and the CIA have said that they are trying to use machine learning tools to anticipate particularly threatening geopolitical developments. And we know also you can, for example, see troop movements via satellite and so on. So the states might try also to perform, use these systems to perform risk calculations. What happens if that other state does attack us? What's likely to happen? What's likely to happen if we don't respond now and we wait? That kind of thing. As you could imagine, I think the biggest challenge is something we've already talked about, which is data. Do you have enough data to develop algorithms that are reliable, right? So if you tried to look at, okay, well, let's look at all of the past cases where one state attacked another, the number is not small, but it's not huge either. It's not millions of times, it's thousands of times. And how do you recreate that data? A lot of it is historical, right? So this is, again, maybe something that we'll start seeing moving forward, that states are thinking about using data this way, but the historical record, it makes it hard to see exactly how it would happen. I think maybe more realistically, the idea of using predictive algorithms to act in self-defense in a cyber setting. So as you know, lots of cyber activity going on right now between states as well as between states and non-state actors. And I think it's possible that states will start to grant algorithms a sort of direct role in responding to cyber attacks, partly because of the need for speed. Right? These attacks happen so fast that sometimes you can't successfully wait for a human to decide how to respond if you're actually going to try to resist them. And one other reason this seems closer at hand is if you look at the DoD directive on autonomy, which they put out a number of years ago, that articulates in general the United States plans to keep meaningful human control over these weapons, there's a carve-out for cyber. And I think that anticipates the need for speed. I don't know if the US is doing it. I have no special knowledge about that, but it does seem like it's a recognition that cyber calls for sort of different treatment in this area. So what would an algorithm determine in that setting? Well, it would basically have to figure out whether an incoming cyber operation was simply a sovereignty violation, was a violation of non-interference, was a use of force, or potentially an armed attack. Can algorithms do that? I don't know. I'm not a computer scientist, so I don't know quite how you would program that. But the idea would be that you're then allowing your system to initiate a response autonomously. And you would have to also ensure that your response adheres to the jus ad bellum rule of proportionality. The final setting is something states have to determine when they're trying to decide whether you use force in self-defense, and those are the rules of proportionality and necessity. So necessity says you have to decide you can only use force if you determine that it's necessary to use force to stop the attack or a subsequent similar attack in the short term. And proportionality says your response needs to be proportional to the incoming attack. It can't be a nuclear weapon against a rifle shot. So here, I think machine learning could help the states work through different options to test whether actually a military response is necessary. Maybe you're running through, well, are sanctions an option? What kind of military response would be proportional if we were to engage, and so on. So in that way, you could actually envision these systems helping a state comply with the rules of proportionality in their response. So similar challenges to the ones we've seen in the use in bello context: quality of data, quantity of data, biases in the data. We haven't really talked much about that, but you need to be sure that you are correctly categorizing a move by a foreign government. They might be from a different culture that has different military strategies, and you don't want to miscalculate based on your own cultural perceptions of what a particular act means. Levels of human involvement. Are we comfortable with cyber automated responses? Maybe we have to be, but those are the kinds of questions that we would have to ask.
Thank you very much. So I really see that we're heading in the right direction because we're actually raising more questions than maybe having answers. But I think that's really it's really stimulating. And for myself, at least, there are a lot of different questions now popping up. But I think it's time to hand you over the mic.